our last and final session today, I would like to welcome Steve Scully. Steve is a VP at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which aims to foster bipartisanship in this country, which, as you can imagine, is not the easiest job these days. Prior to that, he had a 3-decade career at C-SPAN. Sorry. Is that a bug? You're like, C-SPAN.
Yeah. We're America's network.
Yeah. Where he was a politics editor, host, and senior executive producer. He was also on the White House Correspondents Association board, so he knows a ton of people in DC. And he's a Medill and an AU grad, which I know some folks in here are as well.
AU or Medill or both? Oh, great. Go Wildcats.
All right, so please join me in welcoming Steve Scully.
Thank you. Thank you, Ann. Appreciate it. So I began, like many of you, moving around some local markets when I first graduated from American University and Northwestern. Worked in Rock Island, Illinois, and then in my hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, and then Rochester, New York, till I got to C-SPAN. And then I thought I hit the mother lode covering politics, because I love politics, loved it all my life. And right now, in addition to what I do at BPC, I host a 5-day-a-week radio show on Sirius XM, POTUS 124, the old Chris Cuomo radio show. So 10 hours a week doing that, and I do some work for the Hill TV and Nexstar. So I feel like I straddle both worlds. It's interesting because putting on my journalism hat today, the focus, of course, was the horrific story in Turkey and Syria with the death toll now over 2,600 people, which is just horrific. But also the balloon, that Chinese balloon. And it's interesting, as I look at that, that's kind of the driving story. And in the meetings we had this morning for BPC, we're looking for political comedy, COMITY, and bipartisanship. So I wear 2 different hats in the morning as I'm getting ready for my radio show from noon to 2, which I do down the hall from my office. And then I do the work at BPC. And then when I'm on the Hill doing work there, again, I put on my journalism hat. So let me just talk a little bit about what the state of journalism is today. The good news is there's more news and information out there than ever before. There's more places, more choices, more sources. The bad news is there's more news and information out there than ever before, and there's a lot of misinformation. You are really coming into this profession as young journalists with an enormous amount of opportunities, but also some challenges. I was at C-SPAN for 3 decades, and cord cutting has really changed the dynamics of the cable industry. And so when I went to BPC, I thought, okay, I'm going to take a whole new page, never expecting that I would be doing a show 10 hours a week at Sirius XM, which is fun. It's a lot of work, but it's quite enjoyable. I'm sandwiched between Michael Smerconish and Laura Coates, so you can imagine. But my approach to the show is an extension of what I try to do at BPC, which is to cover all sides of a story. And I'll be honest with you, the business model for that is a challenge. CNN is trying to do that right now. They're trying to get away from partisan media and then go to more straight journalism. News Nation, Nexstar is trying to do just that. PBS NewsHour is doing that. But where are people gravitating? They're going to Fox News, they're going to MSNBC. I have a large family. I'm the 11th out of 13 kids, 5 sets of twins. So we have Rachel Maddow in my family, and we have Sean Hannity in my family. And so I kind of feel like my training at Thanksgiving has been good for Bipartisan Policy Center and for Sirius XM because I'm straddling the middle of different points of view. The problem is, in my own family, I can speak about this, I have brothers and sisters who will only watch Fox News. And I have others who will only watch MSNBC. And I keep telling them, you gotta be a good consumer of news. And when I talk to groups about the bias in journalism, they say, oh, there is a bias. Well, sure, Sean Hannity has a bias, but he's not a journalist. He's an opinion maker. Tucker Carlson has a strong point of view. Rachel Maddow has a strong point of view. And so what I try to tell students and young journalists is you want to make sure you understand what the other side is saying, but you also have to appreciate you can appreciate your own point of view, but until you understand where they're coming from, you'll have a real tough time really understanding all points of view. The challenge for you in journalism is how do you do that? The bias, in my opinion, as young journalists, is towards a good story. Because if you watch now, all of this unfolded this last week with this balloon. The House is considering a resolution criticizing Joe Biden for his failure to act. And I thought to myself, just putting on a political hat, that's what's wrong with our politics. Can you imagine if every Congress would pass a resolution because they disagree or felt that the president did something wrong? That you go into a spiral. And what we saw last week when 3 members of Congress were kicked off 2 committees, the Speaker could do the Intelligence Committee. The House voted on Ilhan Omar to be taken off Foreign Affairs because it was a tit for tat. The last Congress was the first time since 1789 that a Speaker had taken members off committee. And so Republicans were ticked off, and so it was payback. I did a town hall meeting last week with 2 members of Congress, and I asked the one member, Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, why he was voting to get Ilhan Omar off the committee. And he said, I'm going to vote for her to take her off the committee, and then we should be done. Let's have a cease and desist. Let Kevin McCarthy, let Hakeem Jeffries sit down, and let's stop this nonsense. But the Republican side of the aisle was really ticked off. And that's part of the problem that we have in our politics today, and that's what's driving a lot of the news cycles that are in our media today. What's going to be the clickbait, what's going to get eyeballs, what's going to get attention. And there are a lot of good sources out there for news and information. And I tell everyone, no good journalist goes to work every day trying to put out misinformation. There are a lot of people who put out misinformation, and I'm not going to mention names, but if you pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or Newsweek magazine online or any other leading publication, ABC News or The Hill or Politico, you want to get it right. You don't want to make mistakes. You don't want to get wrong information out there because your reputation is very much at stake. Let me leave you with this thought, and I'd love to just engage in questions. Over the years, I've had the chance to do a lot of interviews with presidents, former and current. I'll never forget an interview I did with Gerald Ford in Philadelphia in 2000. He literally had a stroke in the middle of the interview. It had nothing to do with my question. It was a TMI. But in the middle of the interview, we're talking about the threat from Iran, and he just kind of talked about onions and hamburgers, and then he got out of it, and then he was rushed to the hospital that evening, and he had a second stroke. So, and he was fine after that. We joked about it years later before he passed away. But the 2 interviews that struck me as I'm coming over here, I think are relevant to what we're talking about. So in December of 2008, I did the second to last interview with President George W. Bush. And Janae knows this at C-SPAN. One of the things that we pride ourselves with is to have a conversation. So I asked for 2 things. I asked for time to do the interview, not the 10 to 12 minutes that you often get with the president. And I wanted to do it in the Oval Office. So let me set the stage. We're in the Oval Office. George W. Bush is always early. And it was an interview set for like 1:15. At about 1:05, the doors open from the dining room, and out walks George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And President Bush says, Dick, you know Steve Scully and the C-SPAN crew, and Cheney kind of grunted and walked out to the Rose Garden and then left. So Bush looked at me and goes, I guess he didn't like his lunch. That was a lunch, I didn't know at the time, in which he said for the final time, I am not going to pardon Scooter Libby. So that's the backdrop to the interview. Bush leaves for a few minutes, comes back in, we do the sit-down interview. We have about 40 minutes. One of the approaches that I've always tried to do as a reporter is take the words that they have said to ask a question. Because if you say, Mr. President, the New York Times said you're the worst president in history, he'll just criticize the New York Times. So, and it's an old Tim Russer joke, who you may or may not remember, who was the longtime moderator of Meet the Press and somebody who I greatly admired. So what I did is I went back to his speech, Bush v. Gore, December of 2000. And I'm paraphrasing. He basically said something along the lines of, I want to be the president that brings the country together, that binds the wounds and the divisions of our nation after a divisive and contentious election. Now the Supreme Court has made the decision. I look forward to working for all Americans to being your president, something like that. So I read that to him. And as I read that to him, I said, so Mr. President, what happened? That was 2000. This is 2008. And he kind of slumped in his chair, and it was almost as if the air came out of the Oval Office. It was just an incredible moment. And he looked at me and he said, I guess I was a more hopeful person back then. But then he went on to say, because I asked him, I said, so Mr. President, what will you be thinking on January 20th when Barack Obama takes the oath of office as the 44th president of the United States? And he said what most Americans would expect him to say. I didn't vote for him. I wanted John McCain to be my president, but he is our president, and I will do everything I can to make him succeed. Publicly or privately, if he succeeds, the country succeeds, I will be cheering him on as a former president, and I will leave the stage so he will have the space to do what he needs to do. Now contrast that to what we saw in 2020 when Donald Trump left the morning of the inauguration and was not even there. So that was the interview with Bush. Fast forward to July of 2019 in the Roosevelt room of the White House with President Trump, who one-on-one is very gracious. I mean, he's a very personable individual. He wants you to like him one-on-one. But what struck me in that interview, we're talking about policy issues and the debt and the deficit and, you know, the 2020 campaign. And just as a random question, I said, so Mr. President, you know, previous occupants of the White House have reached out to their predecessors to ask for advice or counsel and he went on to say, I've had no conversations with none of my predecessors. I have no intention to do so. So I just contrast George W. Bush, a Republican president, and Donald Trump, a Republican president, and two different approaches. And people look at Trump, and I'm not a critic of Trump, but I am a critic of the politics that I think he is really strive for, which is the divisive politics of this country. Because George Bush kept his word and he left the stage and he has become, I guess, good friends with Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama always gives him the mints at funerals. But those two experiences just are kind of a window into the personalities of where we were in 2008. And boy, it's changed a lot in the last 12 to 14 years in terms of our media and politics. So my advice to all of you as reporters is stay firm to your reputation, strive for solid journalism, cover the facts. And if you move into, you know, opinion journalism, nothing wrong with it, but be open to other points of view, because that's where I think our politics has become, unfortunately, much more toxic because there are so many more sources of information out there, so many social media platforms, and it's a real challenge for all of you as you pursue this profession. But as my journalism teacher told me at Northwestern, it's the best profession out there. And I really feel blessed to have the best of all worlds because I straddle between what I do at BPC and SiriusXM and The Hill. And it's a lot of fun, and no day is the same, and it's interesting. You get to see the world, and somebody else gets to pay the expenses. So with that, let's have a conversation.
You mentioned the business case being difficult for middle-of-the-road coverage. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit, because certainly, I mean, now that we can track everywhere that readers are, you know, not just ratings on TV. I mean, you see that everywhere. So journalists are told to be middle of the road, but readers reward them for going to the side. So,
well, you have to do what you're comfortable with. So that's the first thing I would tell you. If you have a strong point of view and you want to espouse that point of view and you want to do analysis, there's plenty of space for you to do just that. When I do my program on SiriusXM, it's called The Briefing, anytime on the SXM app. But when I do the show, I really do try to present all sides. Now, I have a great luxury because they're not worried about ratings, and that was a luxury at C-SPAN as well. SiriusXM has about 40 million subscribers, and they don't care if there's 10 people listening or 10 million. It doesn't matter. PBS NewsHour is another example. But I think what you have to be cognizant of is where do you want to put your talents? And if you want to work for an opinion journalist, nothing wrong with that. It just means that that's going to shape your perspective and point of view. But again, if you work for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and you're not working on the editorial side, the op-ed side, they're looking for solid journalism. They're looking for covering all sides of a complex story. So there is still space for that. All I'm saying is that the big challenge today is, you know, when I was growing up, we had 3 networks. And we had a morning and an evening newspaper. When I first came to Washington, they had an afternoon newspaper when I was in college, the Washington Star. Of course, all of that has changed because of what people want to gravitate towards when it comes to, you know, online journalism. But there's still space for what you're talking about.
Hi, I'm Mariana. I work for the Washington Post, and kind of two-part question. But the first is, you know, tomorrow's State of the Union, and I cover like the live blog basically, and I just want to ask, what's something that you think should be done more when covering these kinds of speeches that draw so much attention, and also like the idea that Joe keeps saying like, oh, I'm willing to work with Republicans and that, and then we have the rebuttal. What would you say? What would you like to see more of reported, and what would you like to see less of reported?
So what I'd like to see, so I did this interview last week, I told you, with 2 members of Congress, Don Bacon and Salud Carvajal, Democrat and Republican, could not be more different. One is from Nebraska, one is from California. Carver Hall's district includes Meghan and Prince Harry, and Oprah lives in his district, and Omaha is home of Warren Buffett. So they really paint a different picture. But here's what's interesting. So we have a program at BPC where we bring members of Congress together and they travel to each other's district. Because years ago, Congress would be in session maybe 4 days a week. Members would live here. They'd be able to travel with family members on soccer games or baseball games or whatever. We don't have that today. And so this is a way to try to replace that. The point is, there are some things that both sides will get together on. You know, we covered George Santos like it's, you know, a major controversy, and it is, but it's because it drives ratings. But they're not going to talk about legislation that both sides will often come together on that will make a huge difference. And there's a lot of that that's happening that is pretty much under the radar screen. But I think that, you know, moving ahead, if you can cover some of that, it may not draw the clickbaits that your boss may want. But when I did the program last week, I was inundated with social media hits like, we need more of this. We need to show that yes, as divided as this town is, and it is divided. And we saw that play out over 15 votes for the speaker, the first time since 1859. So it's been a long time since that happened. But here's why we're seeing that. Because in our politics today, it is broken for a number of reasons. Candidates are more worried about a primary than a general election. There are not members of Congress that are really straddling. It used to be out of 435 House members, there could be 120 to 130 that were in truly swing districts. Now these districts are carved up, even neighborhood by neighborhood. It's going to ensure a Democrat or Republican holds that seat. And so the primary is far more important than the general election, which means there's much less of an incentive to try to deal with some of the big issues. And the debt ceiling is a great example. Because let's be honest, if you look at everything else on the federal budget, 2/3 of the budget, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense spending, and now interest on the debt. So if you in your household spending more than you take in, you got to cut spending. And if that's not going to do it, you got to get a part-time job. And so the only way you're going to cut a $31.4 trillion debt, which by the way was $6 trillion just 2 decades ago. Think about that. Why did we see that? A couple of reasons. Bush and Trump, tax cuts not paid for, 9/11 that we had to pay for, the pandemic, and Democrats who have spent trillions of dollars and not raised taxes. You got to cut spending and raise taxes. You got to increase the cap on Social Security beyond $150,000 a year. Those are really hard choices. And we're hearing it now where President Biden is talking about, you know, I'll never cut Social Security. Well, he won't because it's a big issue for the Democrats. But that's where you need real political compromise. And that's the challenge that we're seeing in our politics today. So anytime you can shine a light on areas where they are coming together on some of the big issues, and there are a few, not as many as you'd expect. You know, I have to laugh this one last point about this infrastructure bill, which I just did an interview with Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, and he had laughed because he said all these Republicans who voted against it, including governors like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott who didn't support it, they're very happy to take the money now for those better roads and bridges and in many cases take credit for it. But there's hypocrisy on both sides, Democrats as well. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Christina. I work for CBS News. And my question is related to, you know, you mentioned the importance of, you know, having both sides of the story and being biased and all that. But obviously in this era that we're living in terms of the difficulty of staying, what we're facing of right now, journalists are kind of like the bad guys.
Oh yeah. Because you're the messenger.
Yes. So any advice on how we can cope on, because I do say that every month, from time to time, I keep hearing from people and even colleagues that tell me, I think I can't keep on doing this. You know, this is a lot. This is not the atmosphere that I started working at. This is not the political atmosphere that I was used to. we are being constantly attacked. We are basically the fake media, the fake news, although we're trying to put both aspects of the story out there as much as we can. Even if you're the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Times, ABC, CBS, but because there is so much you can do, you will always have those people who think news is only those opinion shows. Any advice on how we can continue to, keep pushing or like move forward or stay truth to?
Sure. Well, first of all, Christina, don't give up, because it is a challenge, but it's also really a unique opportunity. I mean, you are on the front lines of history and writing the first draft of history. And so it's an incredible moment for you as young journalists to kind of explore this field and figure out where it takes you. I think part of it is you have to follow your gut, what feels right. Your gut, your emotions are a really good barometer in terms of where you want to take yourself and this profession, because it is hard. I mean, it is hard, but I'm a huge fan. I think Margaret Brennan does a terrific job on Face the Nation. She's really grown into that position as a fierce and tough reporter. Now, if you go on social media when she's on, or Chuck Todd or Shannon Bream on Fox News, they're going to get criticism on both sides of the aisle. And that's what I said, the good news and the bad news. Everyone now can have a voice, and you can be critical or supportive of that voice. And sometimes you just have to kind of shut it down on social media, because if you know your instincts are true, and look, and I get this as well, anytime I ask a question, and when I try to ask a question, I try to be direct and short and to the point. And I don't, I rarely, if ever, ask a three-part question, because what will happen is that the principal may answer the first question and forget the other two, or just sidestep the other two. And if you watch Margaret Brennan, like yesterday, she was on with Ted Cruz, who did a terrific job saying, hey, what about the hypocrisy? But she did it in a very direct way. You supported term limits. You're running for a third term. Explain. Get a very simple, direct question. Nobody can argue that. But of course, on social media, she's going to get beat up, the fake news. Would they ask that same question to Cory Booker? Well, I bet you would, if Cory Booker, and so it is hard out there, but stay true to yourself. And if you are staying in the field of journalism, not opinion journalism, stick to the facts. The bias is always in a good story. And, just over the weekend, this whole balloon thing, even Democrats began to criticize President Biden. Leon Panetta, who served as a Democratic chief of staff, as a member of Congress, as defense secretary, said, you know what, the president has not been transparent in all of this. David Axelrod has called it like he sees them. And people will respect you for that. That's why I like Tim Russert so much. I think because what he was able to do is take a question and try to take the other side and challenge somebody in a way, not to be argumentative, not to be like, and I watch and I like Sean Hannity, and I watch Tucker Carlson, and I like Rachel Maddow. I don't always agree with the way they're asking the questions, but I want to find out what the other side is saying and really, devour, because I try to be a consumer of news. But at the end, you make your own judgment and follow your own instinct. Be what's true to yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this.
Sure.
I just wanted to tap into your kind of institutional experience. Going back to IIJA, and a lot of Republicans voted against it because they thought like any kind of supporting any kind of policy that had Democratic backing would just be a liability politically, even if they personally supported it or what have you. I was wondering if that calculus has always been as prominent as it is today within Congress, and if the share of, I suppose, like true believers of like, no, this is actually poor policy, even though it is like objectively good for my district, has like grown since maybe like in the past 20 years.
It's gotten worse, I'll be perfectly honest, in large part because of cable channels, polarized media, opinion journalism, and social media. I'm reminded Bob Dole and George McGovern, and again, these are names from history, but Bob Dole was probably as conservative as they came, 1996 Republican nominee. George McGovern was a progressive Democrat. And yet when it came to the issue of hunger and food, They said that was not a partisan issue, and they came together on that. I did this, I told you about these ACE trips. So a year ago, I was in St. Paul, Minnesota with Angie Craig, Democrat from St. Paul, and Peter Meyer, who's a member of Congress. He just lost because the Democrats put up a Trump candidate, so he lost in the primary. Again, going back to my point, the primaries are more significant than the general election. During the course of the day, it was really a fascinating day because they had never met each other before. And we picked up Peter Meyer at the airport like 7:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock, and we're on the Mississippi River on one of these barges. And they're driving this, huge cargo ship, and we're going to a community college, and we're going to a meeting with veterans. And at one point, there were two people following them with cameras. And they joked with each other because they thought that the cameras were for the Oppo group that they were going to use in primaries. They didn't care. I mean, Peter Meyer, he's worth probably $10 billion. His dad has a big grocery chain. But a moderate conservative Republican who wants to work across the aisle. And it's a shame that Democrats targeted him because he's exactly what you need in Congress. You need those who will kind of bridge the divide, that you don't just have the AOCs of the world or the Matt Gaetz of the world. You have people that will kind of come together. And most people come to Washington to try to get something done. That's the big misnomer. Even though we're focusing on George Santos and we're focusing on, all the bitter partisanship. But it's gotten worse in the last 20 years because of social media and because of, the politics that they're trying to placate the base. The one good thing that's happening, and I did an interview with Paul Kane of the Washington Post today about this, is that a lot of these same Republicans who are very critical of the fake news, the mainstream media, the lamestream media as they call it, well, guess what? Ted Cruz was on Face the Nation yesterday, and they're appearing on Democrats are appearing on Fox News, and Republicans are appearing on Meet the Press because they know they've got to get to a different audience on ABC's This Week or whatever. So that is good news that we're beginning to break the boil, maybe just a little bit, not as much as we'd like, but it's gotten worse because of the partisan nature of our social media and cable television.
And I actually, I have a follow-up question to that because I remember, I think at the Times a couple of days ago, there was a story about congressional Republicans are coming out more on, more mainstream media outlets that they kind of scorned during the Trump years. Mm-hmm. So how much do you think that was tied personally to President Donald Trump? And how much do you think that was just kind of, I suppose, like the greater movement of the moment, and that's kind of like waning or whatever?
I think it's both. Let's be honest, Donald Trump's influence is waning. I do not think Donald Trump will be the nominee in 2024. I could be wrong, but I think that there'll be enough other Republicans. Look, the Republicans, just looking at it politically, they want to win. They want to win an election. And Donald Trump lost the midterms of 2018. He lost the presidency in 2020, lost the midterms in 2022. So just putting on a purely partisan hat, typically campaigns are always about the future. Donald Trump is very much about the past. You asked about the State of the Union. I think the president will work to try to bridge the divide with Republicans when they can. And if he can work with them, they will. The problem is that the rhetoric from many of the Republicans has been very harsh and not conducive to try to get some things done. This president who's been around for 50 years certainly knows that more than anyone else.
Hi, Eleanor from Politico.
Yes, love Politico. Love Playbook.
Oh, thank you. I'll take credit for Playbook. I think as a younger journalist, I struggle with taking that really tough framing of a story out of fear that those sources will not want to talk to me going forward. You know what I mean? Like, we haven't had the runway to build that relationship and build that trust, and for them to get me to know me and my reputation and feel like they can lean on it. And so I don't know. I'm curious to hear how you would suggest balancing that, if that makes sense, particularly with primaries who might be already like predisposed to be wary of journalists and reporters.
It's not easy, and you're going to find that you will either be yelled at or scorned or criticized by sources. So often when I'm doing an interview, they'll say, you're just focusing on this, right? You're not going to talk about X, Y, and Z. Well, if you're an elected member of Congress or a president, everything is fair game. And so they may be upset at you, but if you build a reputation based on respect and fairness, they'll get over it because they need you as much as you need them. The difference today is they have a lot of choices to go to, and they can go to, if you're a conservative Republican, you can go to Newsmax, you can go to maybe the Washington Times, which is much more friendly to conservatives, and liberals may go to Mother Jones and publications like that. But again, that's why it goes back to what I was telling Christina, finding out what are you most comfortable with, and you have to have a thick skin. You know, I mean, it can be tough out there. But if you have the backing of your editor, and if you're dealing with the facts, then everything else should work itself through. It's not easy, but I think if you do that, you'll be just fine.
Thanks for coming to talk with us today. So my question is more about the approach when booking interviews, and a lot of people have talked about, after the fact, but what if you're facing challenges of people not wanting to come talk to your outlet because you work for a particular outlet, or because they might think that you're leaning a certain way? For example, I was on Capitol Hill like a month ago, was trying to get Lauren Boebert to come talk to us, and once she heard me say ABC News, it was kind of over. So like, what do you do in those situations?
You move on. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires Lauren Boebert to talk to ABC News or anyone else. Donald Trump was criticizing Chris Christie, who's on ABC News over the weekend, in a tit for tat because Christie was going after Donald Trump. It's not healthy. I go back to the good old days of George Bush in 2008 when he talked about how tough it was back in 2008. Boy, I take those days any day over where we are today. But if she's not going to talk to you, now if you're doing a story about her and she's the focus of the story, you clearly indicate that you had repeated requests to get her on air to talk about it. If it's just to get her comment about something and she says no, the way you cover it is if she went to Newsmax or somewhere else, you either pull a clip of that and incorporate that, or you get another voice on there. But it's hard. I mean, it is hard because you're out there and you know that you're trying to do the best damn job you can do, and they're going to criticize you based on the tie you wore, or the way you framed a question, or the way you wrote a story. And the other thing I tell journalists is you got to make sure the facts are right. And I know that doing a show, I'm up at 5:30 in the morning getting ready for the radio show, making sure I get the facts right, because I don't, you can criticize me on anything else, but boy, if I screw something up, and it's hard because it's 2 hours, it's 7-8 interviews during the course of that time. When I Washington Journal, it would be 3 guests and you can take a lot of calls. This is like 8-minute interviews. You keep it moving. There's a lot of sound and there's breaking news in the middle of the day. And so I'm always careful to make sure that I try to get it right. So you want to make sure you don't give somebody the excuse that says, hey, Arthur, I'm not going to you because you screwed up these 7 stories. Get the facts right. If they don't go to you, move on.
Just a quick follow-up.
Sure.
What if it's not like a public figure? What if you're doing MOS, so you're in the field somewhere, and you just keep getting turned down for that same reason? Like,
are you speaking from firsthand experience?
I'm actually not. I'm just really curious.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure
the
it
first
happens.
one was.
Yeah. No, I mean, it does happen. I used to do a lot of interviews at political conventions, and they were easy. But then if you're at political rallies and they see where you're from, I'm not going to talk to you, because you're fake news, especially the Trump rallies. Trump is not, he's not the reason why we're where we are today, but I think he's been the messenger. And I think there's been a real resentment about this sector of the electorate, the so-called MAGA wing. I did an interview with a couple of historians, and they point out that back during the time of back to the Revolutionary War, that basically a third of the country wanted to side with the British, a third of the country wanted to side with the independents, and a third of the country were indifferent. In many ways, the country is that way today. A third of the country polarized Democrats, Republicans, and then kind of the swing voters. And for the MAGA voters, there really is a sense of, Trump can do no wrong, frustration with fake conservatives like John McCain and Mitt Romney, which really led to the creation of Donald Trump in 2015, 2016. And I'll be honest with you, we covered his speech in New York City when he announced, and we thought it was a joke. We just really never felt, not that it was going to be Jeb Bush, but there'd be somebody else who will rise. 2024 is different because he's had a run at the presidency, because of his age, because the Republicans are looking for somebody else. If it's a multiple candidate field, it's going to be hard for somebody to kind of break through. All eyes on Ron DeSantis. I caution everyone, conventional wisdom is just that conventional. So much can change in the course of a couple of weeks in politics. I was in New Hampshire in January 2020, saw Joe Biden the day before he left New Hampshire. He seemed dejected. He got in the car. He came in 5th in New Hampshire primary after coming in 4th in Iowa, and people thought his candidacy was over. And then he rose after South Carolina. So a lot can change in our politics. But just going back to your point, and to your point, Eleanor, you have to have tough skin. And if they say no, you just have to kind of keep chugging along. But it's not easy. Other questions?
Building off of what Eleanor and Arthur asked you about, I'm sure this isn't an issue for you now, but access is one of those forms of currency that is really integral to our career in the DC.
Yeah.
What are some evergreen methods you would say are to develop and gain access to sources, to lawmakers, to people in cabinet positions, things like that?
So one word, relationships, developing relationships. When you meet people, sending a follow-up email. My tip throughout my time covering the White House, and the best beat, by the way, is Capitol Hill. If you want to cover a fun beat, there are 435 members of the House and 100 members of Congress, and about 500 of them think they should be president, and they all want to talk. So and there's never a shortage of stories. But in covering the White House, so I've had the chance to interview, let me think about this, from Gerald Ford to Joe Biden, every president. I'm not that old. They weren't in the White House when I interviewed some of them. But understanding the Deputy Assistant Press Secretary. I'll give you a great example. Jen Psaki was in the Obama White House. And so I just struck up a good relationship with her for a very simple reason. What time's the president leaving tomorrow? Is he doing a trip next week? When's he going to announce his reelection? And sometimes she'd give me some answers, sometimes she wouldn't. Joe Lockhart in the Clinton White House, same thing. Dana Perino, who was Deputy Assistant Press Secretary in the Bush White House, became press secretary. So getting those people early in your career who are the deputies or the assistants that are going to rise up to those positions. Ron Klain, who I met when he was over at Senate Judiciary, and we stayed in close touch and working with him as chief of staff, getting information, and making them genuine. I mean, the thing about this town is it can be very phony, and people can be out for themselves. I know that comes as a shock to you, but making it a genuine, as Janae knows, I used to teach classes at the Washington Center in the University of California. Well, guess what? When Trump was in the White House, I needed a couple of speakers. Hey, Jen, would you come over and speak to the students? And they loved it. And so staying in touch with Jen Psaki during those years, and then she becomes press secretary, and then helping me get interviews with the vice president and the president. I mean, that's how you do it. It's just nothing more complicated than just having those relationships, genuine relationships. And it doesn't have to be that you have to buy them lunch or, but maybe meeting for coffee. And in this town, people who are out of power are often back in power again. And so the people of the Trump world who I've gotten to know thinking that, and I'll give you a great example, Kellyanne Conway, who I've had the chance to work with. And when she became campaign manager, I emailed her and she was on C-SPAN like a week or two later. And I'm like, how did you do that? Because I know her and she knows me. And so she is the campaign manager for Donald Trump in August and September of 2016. And she comes on and takes calls for 30 minutes. It was great because she knows you, he knows you. And that's how this town works. It's all about relationships. When I first came to Washington, Brian Lamb told me, he said, this town is about two things. It's about power and access and a little bit of money. Who has the power and who has the access to the power? Who's the chief of staff? Who's the press secretary? And they all have an agenda. And they all use you and you use them. And that's just how it works. I mean, as a reporter, you want a good story. And often they will want to give you a good story. But having those cordial relationships, sometimes they can become friendships. You never want to cross the line, but that's always been my secret.
And a
it's still paying
reminder
off.
from our talk with Sungmin Kim and Ben Pershing is that power has nothing to do with titles. It's
That's
also
right.
about influence.
Absolutely. Who's the chief of staff? Absolutely. They're both great, by the way. Good friends.
So I guess can I go? Okay. Yeah. Hey, Kirsten, Cox Media Group.
Hi,
Sorry,
Kirsten.
got lost of all the stuff
Do you get
here.
Kristen? My daughter's Kristen, then she gets Kirsten, Christina.
Yeah, I get Kristen,
Yeah.
all the things. Someone tried to add a Y to my name. I'm like, cool, that's
Yeah.
not how it's spelled. But I digress. I definitely wanted to get a sense of, I've had a chance to interview like governors, city council members, outgoing mayors, but obviously I've never done a president. You know, that is something that I aspire to. How do you prepare for that kind of interview where, you know, you have so much to cover? It isn't just a quick
Yeah.
8-minute interview. You talked about 40 minutes with, you know, George W. Bush. I mean, where do you start with that prep? You know, which speeches do you decide to look back to then quote back and say, you know, in 2000, you said X, Y, and Z. Where are you now? Just kind of walk us through, if you can, some of that even prep,
Sure.
or where do you begin with it?
So the first thing I do is look at all the questions that he'd been asked. Hopefully someday will be a she, but for now they've all been men. Look at what he has been asked recently and try to avoid those questions. With Joe Biden, it's been harder because he hasn't done a lot of news conferences. What would drive me nuts is when I would interview Bill Clinton in the morning and then he'd have a news conference in the afternoon. It's like, oh, shoot, you know, whatever news value we had is gone because he had the full news conference. So when I set up an interview with the president and say, are they doing anything else this day? Are we the only interview? And sometimes you can't avoid it. Sometimes they're going to do 3, 4, 5 interviews and give you a short period of time. So trying to get a longer interview is really important. My trick has always been totally ignore the press aide who's going to say you have 12 minutes for the interview. So this happened with Donald Trump in 2019. They said you have 15 minutes. That's it. We're going to cut you off. So the interview was about 27 minutes. And at the end of the interview, they came up and they were really ticked off at me. I'm like, oh, geez, I'm so sorry. You know, I was focusing on the president. And here's what happens more often than not. When the interview is over, they have all the time in the world. He's bringing him to the Oval Office. He had nowhere else to go. He's the president, but so you really ignore what the press aide says. I probably shouldn't say this. I'll get in trouble. But you want to ignore it. You want to, because this is one of the few chances you have to really get a sit-down interview with the president. So what have they been asked before? Don't ask those questions because you know you're going to get something completely different. And try to figure out what you can do that's going to generate news and information that's going to be different from the talking points. Because every elected official, they know if you say, Mr. President, what are you going to do with the debt limit? It's like, oh my God, I know exactly what Joe Biden is going to say. But if you come up with a different line of questioning, and one of my favorite questions, I'm trying to secure an interview with the Vice President, and one of my questions for her is going to be, Madam Vice President, what's the learning curve been like for you as a state attorney general and as a U.S. senator now as Vice President? So it's not a gotcha question. It's not controversial. They're not going to be defensive. But you often get more with that kind of a question if you have the time to do that. Now, if you're a White House reporter and you have a chance to do an interview, ask the president a question, that's where you get the 3-part questions and you're jumping up and you're trying to really navigate a very limited time period. That's a whole different situation than if you're sitting down with the president and have the time. When I interviewed Barack Obama, the one time I interviewed, I'll tell you how I framed the question. He'd been asked a lot of different ways about the Supreme Court appointment, and it ended up being Elena Kagan. But before the interview, we're sitting down in the map room, and all of a sudden there's this bang in the light right next to him. And I was like, what the hell? And he was like, cool as a cucumber. Said, don't worry about it. They fixed the light. I was embarrassed. And so in that interview, I was trying to figure out what can I do that will generate a little bit of news about who he's going to appoint. Because a lot of pressure, is he going to appoint a woman? So I said to him, Mr. President, I know you've been asked a lot about the Supreme Court nominee. What advice has Michelle Obama given you about who you should appoint and how much pressure are you under to select a woman? He burst out laughing and then he answered the question. So we made a little bit of news. Obama was hard because Obama is a lawyer. So you ask him a question, typical lawyer, he'll give you like 7 different parts of the answer. Trump was hard because, you'd ask him a question on A and before he's done to the letter Z. Clinton was hard. I'll give you a Clinton example. So during the post-Monica Lewinsky, post-impeachment, he gave a big speech about, why he was preserving the Constitution by not resigning. So I read an excerpt of the speech and I said, so Mr. President, just what do you mean by this? How did you preserve the Constitution? He got very defensive. But that made some news at that time because it was his first interview after, because I think they might have thought it was going to be easy peasy. And again, I wasn't a jerk. But I wanted to get some news out of it. So That's a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope it helps.
No, it does. And I have one quick follow-up. I think when Barbara Walters obviously passed, a lot of us saw her style, and I know she had one question she would always ask. Is there any one question you always ask your interviewees, regardless of who they are?
Well, let me tell you my favorite Barbara Walters story, because I had the chance to interview her once. And she was interviewing Miss Lillian, the mother of Jimmy Carter, back in 1976 after Carter was elected for a Barbara Walters special on ABC. And she was pressing, Miss Lillian was like 89 years old and that, Southern genteel lady. And she kept pressing Miss Lillian about her son and said, so are you telling me that your son never told a lie? She says, Barbara, I'm telling you, he never told a lie. He was always trustworthy and forthright. He was a Naval Academy grad. He's never, ever told a lie? And then she finally said, well, maybe I can't imitate her, but maybe a little white lie, but not, a white lie? Well, what's a white lie? And she looked at Barbara Walters and she said, remember when you walked in and I said, it's nice to meet you? So I think my approach is explain what you mean, listening. Don't go in with written questions and never, ever read the questions. You're looking at their face, you're having a conversation, but listen to what they're saying. I made a little bit of news with Trump because at that point there was a big debate on how to bring down the debt. And, I said, are there any circumstances you would consider raising taxes? And he broached the idea of a national sales tax in that interview. And I said, well, what do you mean? How would that? And I could tell immediately he was trying to backpedal a little bit because he realized what he was saying. But had I, not paid attention and kind of moved on to the next thing, and I'll give you a great example of that. The great Jim Lehrer, who has passed away, he sat down with President Clinton the day that the Monica Lewinsky story broke. And he was doing the interview the day of the State of the Union address. Check this out on Google. And he didn't realize till after the interview, Bill Clinton was talking in present tense. I'm not having a relationship with her right now. Never anything in past tense. And after the interview was over, he realized in a way he'd been duped by Bill Clinton because he never said, well, has there ever been a relationship with Monica Lewinsky? And he would be the first to admit, I should have been paying more attention. I was more concerned about trying to get the next question out there. And we told him it was going to be on State of the Union and totally missed that part of the story. So paying attention, following up, what do you mean by that? Explain. And often that's where you're going to get the best news. You respect the person who you're interviewing. You want to be tough. You want to give them the space to make some news. And unless there's a need to really be confrontational, and sometimes there is, but if you want to get something out that nobody else is going to get, that's often been my approach. You need the time though. You can't do that in 5-10 minutes. You need 30 or 40 if you can get it, even 20. And don't pay attention to the press secretary who says, time's up.
As you were kind of talking about before, to getting to where this point, we've all kind of like part of the responsibility and sort of looking a bit internally. You've been part of the Washington press corps for a while. How has it, improved anyway to this point of getting us to where we are, and what would you say is a failure or just anything that we need to improve upon as journalists going into the future?
I should point out James works with my son at Fox News, so and he loves it. So thanks for being such a great mentor to him. We appreciate it. You are doing really important work. Each one of you, really important work. And if not for the press, how often would stories not be covered? And the big challenge we have right now is not the Washington press corps, because there's a lot of you here covering it. The big challenge is what's happening in Harrisburg and Scranton or Sacramento and in small towns and capitals that are not having the resources that we have here. But as much of a challenge as it is, and it's a far greater challenge now than it was even 15, 20 years ago. I think if you talk to veterans like the Sam Donaldsons of the world, who you may or may not remember, it was tough for him as well. You have an obligation to get it right, to admit mistakes as you make mistakes, to understand that the bias is towards a good story, and to cover the facts. And again, follow your own instinct. But it is harder today than it has been in the past, and that's one of the great challenges that you have. But also with that comes a lot more opportunities. I mean, we were talking about Griff Jenkins and Mike Emanuel. They do terrific reporting. I think Bret Baier's show is truly one of the best news programs out there. And it's a very different program than you're going to get on Fox and Friends or on Sean Hannity's show, which is fine because they have a very different approach to the news. Just like you're going to get a different slice on the second hour of CBS This Morning than you're going to get in the first hour. But again, with the challenges, you have the opportunities. I hope that answered it, James. Did I? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Minnie from Time.
Hi, Minnie.
I was wondering if you could talk in more detail about building genuine relationships in DC. I was talking to a colleague about this, and he was suggesting like, oh, you can talk about, this latest TV show or whatever. But I also feel like my personal interests are very different from what a lot of sources I might want to talk about. So it's kind of hard to find those connections.
I wish Baggy Haberman were here from the New York Times. She just wrote the great book, Confidence Man. And she has discussed this in detail as well. I think part of it is, first of all, if you have a beat, this is a very transient town. So it can be hard sometimes, especially with every 4 or 8 years, there's a new cabinet secretary and Congress changes hands so often. But if you have a beat, understanding who are the policymakers that are shaping that particular area, whether it's labor or transportation or foreign policy at the State Department. And again, my approach has always been to the lower level staffers are often those who are more amenable to you, and they can give you access to the senior level staffers as well. I did that when I first came to C-SPAN when Madeleine Albright became the UN ambassador. I had no idea that she was going to become Secretary of State, but getting to know people around her then helped me when we wanted to do things with her, both when she was Secretary of State and as she left the White House. It's simple things like, hey, can we grab a cup of coffee? Or can we meet in the morning? Or you might be at an event with Politico and you're going to run into fellow reporters. Bob Cusack, who I've known for many years at thehill.com, he and I, would go out, not a lot, maybe once or twice a year for a drink or a beer or whatever, and just developing, talking sources and what he's doing. So you have to work it. I mean, it's not easy. It's not going to come easily. It's like having, any relationship, whether it's, dating somebody or colleagues, whatever, you've got to work it. But I think making it genuine and not that you're, it takes time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It will take time. If you're here for a long time like me, serving on different boards, the White House Correspondents Association, getting to know people, going to events when I can, not all the time, but networking is a really good part of it. I've gotten to know a lot of the people over at Semaphore, which is a new website that's doing terrific work because of the work that they've done at the Hill and elsewhere, and Steve Clemens. And now, because I'm doing a radio show 5 days a week, 10 hours a week total, I'm having these reporters on, so you further develop those relationships as well. But it takes time.
I'm Jackie. I'm with
Hi, Jackie.
CQ. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
Relationship building. I think I mostly like everyone I meet. Like, I don't automatically go, I don't like this person, but sometimes that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, you've been in DC for so long, you've met so many people, you've built so many relationships. Like, have there been times when someone important to, connecting you with some person, you just don't get along? Like, did you ever have to navigate that?
Of course. And you may not like them, or they may not like you. I'm not going to mention names because if I do, you'll know who I'm talking about, but I'll give you a great example of somebody who I had developed I thought a rather cordial relationship with for many, many years. Was asked to do an event at GW about 2 years ago. This individual was a senior advisor to President Trump. And I asked basically a random question, has the president been truthful in his 3.5 years in the White House? And this person took great offense to the question. And it ended what I thought was a good relationship, a good friendship. Not a close friendship, but a good acquaintance. And that kind of hurt me because to me, it was a legitimate question. Same thing would be if you asked a question about, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, why did he cover that up? So that would be a legitimate question as a journalist to ask. So it does go both ways. They may not like you, you may not like them, but that's life, unfortunately. And whether you're a journalist or a lawyer or whatever you do, if you're a doctor, you might have patients you don't like. It's going to cut across the gamut of society in general. And so kind of going back to Christina, having a thick skin and not letting it get to you, and holding your head high, knowing that you're doing the very best that you can do. I mean, the years that I was at C-SPAN, I was excited to go to work because I felt like I was really doing something good. And where I'm at today, I feel the same way. I feel like I'm really, am I making a difference? I hope so, maybe in a small way, certainly not a major way. But, with the radio show, trying to figure out ways we can bridge the political divide, putting on programming that's not going to just focus on the negative, but the positive. We're going to be doing a whole bunch more town hall meetings with members of Congress to showcase that partisan divide. And look, partisanship is good. The country was founded on that. Fierce debate is good. You want that. All you also want at the end of the day is how do you put aside some of those political differences to solve something that's far bigger for the country. And that's why I go back to that George W. Bush story, which I think, really encapsulates, I think, what our country should be all about. Somebody who is a fierce partisan, didn't like Barack Obama, was leaving the stage and said, you know what, if he's a successful president, it's good for the country. And that's what our democracy is all about. Without sounding too altruistic, it's really, I think, as citizens defending the First Amendment, which is hard, and dealing with the challenges that you will deal with every single day, knowing that you're doing the best damn job you can do, holding people accountable, feet to the fire, and telling the truth. You can't ask for anything more than that.
You mentioned PBS NewsHour earlier.
Yeah.
Are there other, newsletters, news products that you think do an especially good job of showing kind of both sides, especially politically?
Yeah, I mean, without The Hill, I think, does a great job because I think they really, newspaperhill.com, I think they really do try to focus on all sides of the story. CNN is trying to get there. Nexstar in News Nation is really striving to be kind of straight down the middle. And, I would argue, and I know this may cause a lot of disagreement, the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and USA Today, they're all out there every day trying to cover just the facts. There's analysis pieces out there as well, and they're important to read. But, day in and day out, those news organizations are really, the Associated Press. I mean, there's a lot out there that you can gravitate towards. Again, let's be honest. It's the scintillating story that might get the most eyeballs on the Drudge Report. But there are a lot of places out there. And I think where I work at SiriusXM, look, they told me I had no intention of doing a radio show. They wanted the brand of being bipartisan and covering all sides. They didn't want opinion journalism. They didn't want the Chris Cuomo show. They wanted something completely different. And, 7-8 months in, I think that they're happy with it because it offers them something. But again, we don't have to worry about ratings. Mm-hmm. The challenge is the morning shows, it's all about what's going to generate eyeballs. So that's hard.
Do you want to talk about the Bipartisan Policy Center and what experts are there and what you
Sure.
can offer in terms of
Yes,
sources?
so we are a great source. I'll put on my communication hat. We cover healthcare, the debt, immigration, a little bit of foreign policy, technology issues. I was just asked to be on the advisory board of the Keith Kroc Institute, which is working on technology. Frank McCord is a big advisor. He's working on a huge plan that will be the next platform beyond Google. So if you're looking for an expert in any area, and go to our website at bipartisanpolicy.org, we can have access to anyone that you want. And we really strive to be, all sides of the issue. So if you want a Republican point of view, we have Republicans policy advisors. We have Democratic policy advisors. It was founded by 4 Senate leaders: Bob Dole, Republican; Howard Baker, Republican, who's since passed away; George Mitchell, Democrat; and Tom Daschle, Democrat. Tom Daschle and George Mitchell, sadly, are the only 2 alive today, but it was founded 15 years ago for a very simple reason: have that fierce debate, present all sides of an issue, and then get that information out there. So whether it's the debt ceiling, Social Security, Medicare, if you watched 60 Minutes a few months ago, one of our policy experts on immigration was on with Anderson Cooper. So we have a lot of people that really can benefit you if you want substance and if you want to get another point of view. So if you have a member of Congress and you're not getting that Democrat or Republican, reach out to me. You have my email address and I'll connect you with anyone that you want. We do podcasts. We have my radio show now. We have the Senate Project, which is something else that we're excited about, which is bringing Democratic and Republican senators together for debates. We did 2 last year, one in Boston with Bernie Sanders and Lindsey Graham. We did one last summer at GW with Rob Portman and Chris Murphy. We have 3 planned this year, one in March in Boston, one in May in Utah with Chris Coons and Tim Scott, and then we'll have another one in the fall here. The goal with that is, because a lot of senators don't recognize what the Senate was like, we want that debate. Brett Baer's done some of them. They've been on C-SPAN. We only have one request at the end, is at the end of whatever the issues happen to be, whether it's healthcare, immigration, the debt, are there any areas of agreement between the two? In the first debate, there were no areas of agreement between Bernie Sanders and Lindsey Graham. In the second debate, there were, especially when it came to gun control. And so we're trying to foster that kind of fierce debate, partisan divide. Are there areas that we can come together? And so if we can help you out on any of that, let me know. We'd love to have you. We'd love to be included.
Steve Scully, thank you so much.
Thank you all.